In 2019, my daughter-in-law leaned toward my son and whispered something she thought I couldn't hear. Cut him off. He's too small for this life. I was standing 10 feet away, holding a paper plate and a plastic fork in a $1.2 million penthouse overlooking Minneapolis. The wine wall behind her probably cost more than the first house I ever bought. I looked down at my old work boots. Scuffed leather, union-stitched, honest. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I just nodded and walked out of my own son's new life. For 3 years they lived the life she wanted. 3 years of silence. Until the morning her divorce lawyer called me first, and his voice wasn't steady. Welcome to Final Act Revenge, ladies and gentlemen. Please note, this story contains fictionalized elements created for educational and entertainment purposes. Before we go further, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is right now. Take a breath, get some water. Because what that lawyer said next changed everything. My name is William Broadhead. Most people call me Will. I turned 66 the spring before that party in Minneapolis, and I had already retired from the electrical union after 41 years pulling wire through cold walls and hotter ceilings than most people would ever tolerate. I wasn't flashy. I never needed to be. I lived in a modest 2-bedroom house outside Duluth, near the lake where the wind cuts through you in November. My pension came in every month like clockwork. $3,400. Enough to pay the bills, keep the furnace running, and replace a roof when it had to be replaced. That was the life I understood. What Natalie never cared to ask was what I did with the overtime pay back in the late 90s. In 1998, after a job in Milwaukee, I put $20,000 into a small warehouse partnership. Nothing glamorous, just loading docks and concrete floors. Over the years, I kept rolling profits into similar properties, strip plazas, storage units, places people drove past without noticing. I never talked about it at Thanksgiving. I never needed applause. Evan grew up watching me leave before sunrise. He also grew up hearing my father tell me I should have gone to college. Electricians don't build legacies, he used to say. That sentence stayed with me longer than it should have. I swore I would never measure my own son by the shine of his shoes. Evan was sharp. Numbers came easy to him. By 2018, he was working as a financial analyst in Minneapolis. Clean suits, glass office, performance bonuses tied to quarterly projections. He married Natalie Cross the following year. She was bright, articulate, always scanning a room as if it were an audition. I don't think she was cruel by nature. I think she was afraid of looking ordinary. The penthouse wasn't something Evan bought outright. It was structured as a lease to own agreement in 2020, 36 months, escalating payments. I knew that because I read public filings the way some men read baseball stats. Old habit. When you've signed contracts your whole life, you learn to read the fine print. After that night in 2019, the calls slowed. Then they stopped. Holidays passed. Birthdays passed. I told myself he was busy. Pride can sound reasonable when you're alone in a quiet kitchen. One afternoon in 2022, I pulled up a refinancing record tied to the same address. The numbers didn't line up with full ownership. They lined up with pressure. And pressure has a way of exposing things people would rather hide. That was the first moment I realized my son wasn't standing on solid ground, even if he believed he was. The last real conversation I had with Evan before everything went quiet happened on a Tuesday night in October of 2020. He called around 9. His voice sounded distracted, like he was pacing. "Dad, things are just busy," he said. "We're building something different up here." Different. That word lingered. I asked him if he was happy, not successful, not promoted. Happy. There was a pause long enough for me to hear the faint echo of the city through his window. "Yeah," he said finally. "We just need space." Space. I told him I understood, even though I didn't. After that call, Thanksgiving came and went without an invitation. Christmas was small this year. By spring, 3 months had passed without a single text. Pride is quiet. It doesn't slam doors. It simply waits. In early 2021, I began checking property records more carefully. Not because I was suspicious of my son, but because something felt rushed. The penthouse lease-to-own agreement had been filed through a holding structure tied to a downtown development group. 36 months, escalating payments, equity only after consistent on-time installments. I've signed enough contracts in my life to know when a timeline is tight. Then I saw it. A refinance inquiry in mid-2022. Not a full mortgage. A short-term liquidity move. That told me something. You don't refinance something you truly own. You leverage it. And leverage is often another word for strain. Around the same time, I heard from an old acquaintance who worked in corporate compliance. Evan's company had started tightening internal credit reviews for employees in finance roles. Nothing public, just policy shifts. That's when the pieces began lining up in my mind. One evening, I drafted an email to him. It was simple. If you ever need to talk, I'm here. I didn't send it. I sat there staring at the screen, remembering a night in 1993 when I asked my own father for help after overextending myself on a pickup truck loan. He told me, "A man who can't stand on his own doesn't deserve a hand." I promised myself I would never repeat that sentence, but I also knew something else. Rescuing too early can be another form of harm. In late summer of 2022, I noticed a missed payment record attached to the lease filing. 17 days late. It wasn't catastrophic, but it reset the equity clock. Legally speaking, the 36-month timeline started over. That meant they weren't 3 years into ownership. They were back at month 1. I leaned back in my chair and let that settle. Not because I wanted them to fail, but because I understood something they didn't. They weren't building equity. They were renting confidence, and confidence built on borrowed ground doesn't stand very long, especially when the ground isn't really yours. By early 2023, the silence between us had settled into something heavier than anger. It was routine. I would wake up, make coffee, check the weather over Lake Superior, and then, almost without thinking, I would open the county filings page. Not every day. Just often enough to notice patterns. Patterns tell you more than emotions ever will. That was when I saw the second late payment. Not 30 days. Not catastrophic. Just enough to trigger the clause I had read twice before. If payments were not made consistently and on time, accrued equity would not vest. It would reset. Clean slate. Legally sterile. Most people don't understand how contracts protect structure, not feelings. I printed the document that afternoon and set it on my kitchen table. The lease-to-own agreement wasn't complicated. 36 months, escalating payments, equity accumulation only after full compliance. Miss the rhythm. You lose the music. I didn't smile when I realized what that meant. I didn't feel victorious. I felt tired. Because the truth was simple. Evan and Natalie weren't nearing ownership. They were circling it. A few weeks later, I received a call from Marcus Doyle. He had been reviewing annual filings for Broadhead Industrial Holdings, the holding company I formed years ago. "Will," he said carefully, "the Minneapolis unit is still under the LLC umbrella. Nothing has transferred." I let that sit. "Has it ever?" I asked. "No," Marcus replied. "And with the payment resets, it legally can't until conditions are met." Conditions. That word echoed in my mind longer than it should have. I drove out to the lake that evening, sat on the hood of my truck like I used to when Evan was a boy. He once asked me why I never wore dress shoes. I told him boots remind you what you're standing on. I wondered what he believed he was standing on now. Late that night, I saw something else, a refinance inquiry tied to personal credit lines. It wasn't attached to the property itself. It was attached to Evan. That told me the pressure wasn't coming from the building. It was coming from inside the life they were trying to maintain. I imagined Natalie scrolling through photos of kitchens and skyline views. I imagined her telling herself this was security, that money equals safety. I didn't hate her. I saw the fear in it. But fear, when dressed as pride, becomes expensive. Then came the third detail, a formal notice logged in public record, a conditional warning tied to the lease, not eviction, not yet. Just a reminder that equity had not accrued due to missed compliance windows. I stared at the line for a long time. They believed they were almost owners. Legally, they were still tenants. And if one more payment slipped, everything they thought they had built would disappear on paper. I folded the document and placed it back in the envelope. For the first time since that night in 2019, I felt something close to clarity. Not revenge, understanding, because if they missed one more payment, they would legally own nothing at all. Pressure does not arrive all at once, it seeps in. By late 2023, the filings were no longer subtle. Credit lines expanded. Short-term borrowing increased. The rhythm of the payments shifted from steady to strained. When you have worked around electricity your whole life, you learn to recognize overload before the breaker trips. I wasn't inside their apartment, but numbers leave footprints. Evan had taken on a second line of revolving credit tied to his personal income, $74,000 in unsecured exposure. That is not reckless by Wall Street standards, but for a young couple balancing a lease-to-own contract at over $8,000 a month, including association fees, it is thin ice. I imagined the dinners, the curated table settings, the photographs posted at just the right angle to show skyline glass and polished stone. Natalie had a gift for presentation. I'll give her that. She could make a rented space feel permanent with nothing but lighting and confidence. But presentation does not change ownership. One Sunday afternoon, I received a short voicemail from Evan. "Hey Dad, just checking in. We're busy. Hope you're good." No invitation, no follow-up. I listened to it twice. The space between his words told me more than the words themselves. A week later, Marcus called again. "They're late," he said quietly. 17 days this time. "Is it enough?" I asked. "It resets accrual," he replied. Again. Again. That meant the equity clock was back to zero, 36 months required without interruption, and they had just restarted the timer for the second time. That evening, I drove to the hardware store and bought nothing. I just walked the aisles the way I used to when I needed to think. The smell of lumber grounds a man. Reminds him what holds weight and what only looks sturdy. I remembered 1993, the year I nearly lost everything over a pickup truck I couldn't afford. I had wanted to prove something to my own father, that I could rise above his expectations, that I could look successful instead of steady. I paid for that lesson in overtime shifts and sleepless nights. Evan, I realized, was paying for a different version of the same lesson. Then came the first real crack. Through a compliance contact I had known for years, I learned that Evan's employer had initiated internal reviews for senior analysts with elevated debt ratios. Nothing public, just policy tightening. Companies don't like risk where numbers are involved. Risk had found my son. 2 weeks later, I saw a public notice tied to the property. Not a foreclosure, not even a warning of eviction. It was administrative. A reminder that ownership transfer conditions had not been satisfied. Most people would skim past a line like that. I didn't. I understood what it meant. They believed they were building equity. Legally, they were rebuilding eligibility, over and over. I sat at my kitchen table and traced the timeline on a legal pad. 2020 lease, 2022 reset, 2023 reset. 3 years had passed, and they were still at the starting line. That night, for the first time since the party in 2019, anger flickered. Not at Natalie, not even at Evan, at the illusion itself, at the way pride can convince a man he is rising when he is only circling. I poured a glass of water and let it pass. Anger is loud. Contracts are quiet. 3 days later, Natalie filed for divorce, and this time, the paperwork didn't come through public record first. It came through a lawyer. The divorce petition was filed on a Thursday afternoon in early spring of 2024. I found out the way most people find out about things they were never meant to see, through paperwork. Public docket, Hennepin County. Natalie Cross Broadhead listed as petitioner. Evan Broadhead listed as respondent. Irreconcilable differences. That phrase always sounds polite. There is nothing polite about unraveling a life. 2 days later, my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, Minneapolis area code. I let it go to voicemail. Old habit. If it matters, they leave a message. They did. Mr. Broadhead, this is Grant Holloway. I represent Natalie Cross Broadhead in a pending dissolution matter. I need clarification regarding an ownership structure tied to Broadhead Industrial Holdings. Ownership structure. I sat down slowly. Grant's voice was controlled, not emotional, not hostile. Just professional. But there was something else in it. Uncertainty. I called him back the next morning. "This is William Broadhead," I said. There was a pause before he responded. "Sir, am I correct in understanding that you are the sole member of Broadhead Industrial Holdings, LLC?" "Yes." "And that the Minneapolis penthouse property is currently held under that LLC?" "It is." Another pause. Longer this time. Grant cleared his throat. "My client was under the impression that the property had transitioned into personal ownership under a lease-to-own agreement initiated in 2020. "It did not," I replied. "Conditions were not satisfied." Silence. You could hear paper being turned on his end. "There were missed compliance windows," he said carefully. "Yes," he exhaled. "That changes the asset classification significantly." It did more than that. It erased it. That afternoon, for the first time in nearly 3 years, Evan called me directly. Not voicemail, not a text. His name lit up my screen. I let it ring twice before answering. "Dad." His voice sounded thinner, stripped down. "I didn't know," he said. "I know," I replied. There was breathing on the line. No anger, just confusion. "She said we were building equity," he continued. "We were almost there." "No," I said quietly. "You were restarting." He didn't argue. After a moment, he said something that caught me off guard. "Did you know this whole time?" That question carried more weight than he understood. "I read contracts," I answered. "That's all." He swallowed. "Why didn't you say anything?" Because I had once been a young man who wouldn't have listened. Because pride closes ears before it closes doors. Because some lessons only land when the ground shifts under your feet. But I didn't say all that. "I was waiting for you to call," I told him. He was quiet. Then, almost in a whisper, "I might lose my job." There it was. Not the penthouse, not the divorce. The job. The identity. Corporate compliance had escalated internal reviews. Elevated debt exposure for someone handling financial projections is not a comfortable position to be in. Risk travels fast in glass offices. "Are you safe?" I asked him. "I don't know," he said. Later that day, Grant called again. This time his tone was different, less procedural, more cautious. "Mr. Broadhead, under the current structure, you retain full authority regarding continuation or termination of the lease." "I understand," I said. "If you choose not to extend," he continued carefully, "the property would revert fully to corporate control. It already had. Grant lowered his voice. My client is asking whether you intend to terminate the lease. That word echoed in my kitchen. Terminate, clean, legal, absolute. I looked down at my boots resting beside the chair. Same ones from that night in 2019. Still holding, still grounded. For 3 years, I had been the man who was too small for this life. Now, I was the man holding the switch. And the next move was entirely mine. I drove to Minneapolis the following Monday. 6 hours on the road gives a man too much time to think. The sky was gray the whole way down. Late winter refusing to leave. Fitting, I suppose. Some seasons don't let go easily. The building looked the same as it had in 2019. Glass, steel, a lobby that smelled faintly of polished stone and expensive air. I parked across the street and sat there for a moment. Not gathering courage, just remembering. I walked in wearing the same boots Natalie once found embarrassing. Nobody stopped me. Nobody cared. That's the funny thing about status. It matters most to the people who are afraid of losing it. Grant Holloway met me in a small conference room on the 23rd floor. Evan was already there. He looked older than 35. Not physically, in the eyes. Natalie sat across from him, straight back, chin lifted, controlled. But there was tension in her fingers. They kept tightening around a leather folder. Grant began in that steady attorney tone. We're here to clarify asset classification before proceeding with division discussions. Classification. Such a cold word for something people build their identity around. He slid a copy of the lease agreement toward Natalie. The lease-to-own agreement initiated in 2020 required 36 consecutive compliant payments before equity vesting. There were resets in 2022 and 2023. Natalie frowned. We made payments. Yes, Grant replied calmly, but not within required compliance windows. Equity never accrued. Evan looked at the paper as if seeing it for the first time. I watched him, not her. Natalie turned toward me. You knew about this? I read what was public, I said. Her jaw tightened. You let us believe. I didn't let you believe anything, I answered evenly. The contract said what it said. Silence settled heavy in the room. Grant cleared his throat. Mr. Broadhead, as sole member of Broadhead Industrial Holdings, LLC, you retain authority to continue or terminate the lease. Without your extension, the property reverts fully under corporate control within 30 days. 30 days. Natalie inhaled sharply. That's eviction. It's enforcement, Grant corrected. Evan finally spoke. His voice was low. Dad, are you going to end it? That question wasn't about the apartment. It was about something deeper. I leaned back in the chair and looked at both of them. For a moment, I saw them not as adversaries, but as two young people who had tried to outrun insecurity and tripped over the paperwork. Natalie, I said, turning to her gently, why did you think ownership meant safety? She hesitated. For the first time since I had known her, she didn't have a polished answer. My parents lost their house in 2008, she said quietly. Everything disappeared. I told myself I would never feel that small again. There it was. Not arrogance, fear. Fear dressed up as lifestyle. Evan stared at the table. I thought if I could give her stability, it would fix everything. I nodded slowly. Stability built on debt isn't stability. It's leverage. Grant shuffled papers. We still need a decision, Mr. Broadhead. Yes or no? Terminate or extend? Punish or protect? I remembered my own father telling me a man who can't stand alone deserves to fall. I also remembered how long that sentence echoed in my head. I looked at Evan. You asked me on the phone why I didn't say anything, I began. Because some lessons have to show themselves. If I had stepped in early, you would have thought I was controlling you. He didn't argue. Natalie's voice softened. So, what are you going to do? I folded my hands. I'm not terminating the lease, I said. Both of them exhaled at once. But, I continued, I'm not pretending ownership exists where it doesn't. Grant leaned forward. Are you proposing a restructure? Yes. The words shifted the air in the room. I will restructure the agreement under Evan's name alone, I said. No joint exposure, no illusion of shared equity until payments are compliant for 36 uninterrupted months. Natalie's eyes widened. So I get nothing? You get clarity, I replied. Grant nodded slowly. That removes the property from marital division. Natalie looked at me as if seeing me clearly for the first time. Not small, not poor, not irrelevant, just steady. Evan swallowed. You had the power to end it all. Yes, I said quietly. And you didn't. No. Grant closed the folder. I'll draft the revised terms. The meeting was technically over, but the real weight hadn't lifted yet. Because what I had offered was not rescue. It was responsibility. And responsibility is heavier than eviction. As we stood to leave, Evan asked one more question. Dad, why help me now? I paused at the doorway. Because I almost let my own father's pride destroy me once, I said. And I won't let yours destroy you. But even as I said it, I knew the hardest part was still ahead. Because restructuring paper is easy. Restructuring a man's sense of worth is not. The paperwork moved faster than emotions ever do. Within 2 weeks, Grant Holloway finalized the restructuring terms. The lease would continue under Evan Broadhead alone. No shared exposure, no assumed equity. 36 clean months required before anything vested. Clear, measured, legal. Natalie signed her portion of the divorce agreement without looking at me. She kept her composure until the very last page. Then her pen paused. Just for a second. I never wanted to lose everything, she said quietly. You didn't, I replied. You just misunderstood what everything was. She nodded once, not in agreement, in recognition. There is a difference. By early summer, she had moved out. The Instagram posts stopped. The Skyline dinners disappeared. Chloe Benton unfollowed both of them. Public life evaporates quickly when the lighting changes. Evan stayed in the penthouse, but it did not look the same. When I visited in July, half the decorative pieces were gone. The designer bar stools replaced with simpler ones. One of the 3 espresso machines sat unplugged in a box. He had sold the Tesla. Small adjustments, necessary ones. Then came the blow I had hoped would not arrive, got in August. Evan called me at 6:12 a.m. I remember the exact time because I was halfway through pouring coffee. Dad, his voice was hollow. They let me go. Internal compliance review, elevated personal leverage, corporate risk assessment, no scandal, no public statement, just a quiet separation. A financial analyst who cannot demonstrate stable financial discipline becomes a liability. Glass offices are unforgiving. I didn't ask how he felt. I asked where he was. At home, he said. When I arrived that afternoon, the penthouse was dim, curtains half drawn, lights off despite the cloudy day. Trying to save on utilities, he said with a weak smile. That broke something in me more than anger ever could. He sat at the kitchen island, staring at a printed termination letter. It looked thinner than the lease agreement had, yet somehow heavier. I thought I was building something, he said. You were, I answered. What? Pressure. He didn't laugh. He didn't argue. He just nodded slowly, as if the word fit. For the first time since 2019, there was no defense in his posture, no performance, just a tired man who had run too hard in the wrong direction. We sat in silence for several minutes. Then he asked it. Was I ever enough? Or was I just trying to be more than you? The question didn't accuse. It searched. I remembered standing in my father's garage 30 years earlier, asking something similar and receiving nothing but pride in return. I looked at my son, not the analyst, not the husband, not the man who once thought I was too small, but the boy who used to hold my hand crossing frozen parking lots. "You were always enough," I said. "You just forgot what enough looks like." He covered his face with his hands, not crying loudly, just breathing unevenly. That afternoon, I showed him the full lease history, every reset, every missed compliance window, every warning he had skimmed over. "This wasn't about intelligence," I told him. "It was about assumption." He shook his head. "I thought ownership was automatic once you paid long enough." "No," I said. "Ownership is conditional. So is trust." The weight of that sentence settled between us. Outside, the city moved as if nothing had happened. Traffic, distant sirens, elevator cables humming somewhere in the walls. Inside, my son sat in a home he technically did not own, without a job, newly divorced, staring at a future that suddenly felt smaller than the one he had tried to escape. And I realized something difficult in that moment. I had prevented the collapse of the apartment, but I had not prevented the collapse of his certainty. Sometimes mercy keeps the roof intact. It does not keep a man from feeling the ground shift beneath him. As I stood to leave that evening, he looked up and asked softly, "What happens now?" I paused at the doorway. "Now," I said, "we find out who you are without the illusion." But even as I said it, I knew the next decision would test both of us more than any contract ever had. The hardest part was not the divorce, not even the job loss. It was the silence after the collapse. For 2 weeks, Evan moved through the penthouse like a man living inside a memory of himself. He kept the lights low, cooked simple meals, sold off the last of the designer furniture to reduce monthly strain. No performance, no skyline dinners, just numbers on a yellow legal pad. I didn't rescue him, I showed up. There's a difference. One afternoon, we sat across from each other at the long kitchen counter, the same counter that once held catered trays and polished wine glasses. Now it held spreadsheets printed from his laptop. "I ran projections," Evan said quietly. "If I cut expenses by 40% and find contract work within 60 days, I can stabilize." "Good," I replied. He looked up. "You're not going to cover the gap?" "No." The word landed heavy, not cruel, not cold, just steady. "You didn't protect me from the fall," he said. "I protected you from eviction," I answered. "The rest is yours." He absorbed that, slowly. That evening, Grant Holloway requested one final mediation call. Natalie had questions regarding remaining obligations. I joined remotely. Evan sat beside me, shoulders squared but no longer defensive. Natalie's voice came through the speaker, softer than before. "I never meant to hurt anyone," she said. "I was trying to make sure we'd never be small." "You confused small with simple," I told her. There was a pause on the line. Grant stepped in. "The revised agreement stands. No divisible real property exists. Personal debts remain separate. No divisible real property exists." That sentence was the cleanest public correction of all the assumptions made 3 years earlier. Natalie exhaled. "So, that's it?" "That's clarity," Grant replied. After the call ended, Evan remained seated. "She wasn't evil," he said. "I know," I answered. "Fear rarely is." 3 days later, something shifted again. Evan received an offer, not from a corporate tower, but from a regional advisory firm. Smaller, less prestige, stable. The salary was lower, but the exposure manageable. He showed me the offer letter. "Should I take it?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "Take the job that lets you sleep." He nodded. For the first time in months, there was steadiness in his eyes. That night, as I prepared to leave Minneapolis, he walked me to the elevator. "Dad," he said, hesitating, "you could have ended the lease when she filed." "Yes." "You waited." "Yes." "Why?" I studied his face, not searching for weakness, but for understanding. "Because power used too quickly becomes revenge," I said, "and I wasn't interested in revenge." He looked down at my boots, the same boots that once embarrassed him. "I thought you were poor," he admitted. "I am," I replied, with a faint smile. "Poor in the things that don't matter." He almost laughed. Almost. As the elevator doors opened, he asked one more question. "Do you still trust me?" Trust. Not money. Not ownership. Trust. "That depends on what you build next," I said. The doors closed between us. Driving north that evening, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not satisfaction, not victory, relief. The illusion had collapsed. The contracts had held. The marriage had ended. The job had been replaced. But the real test had only begun. Because rebuilding a life without illusion is quieter than losing it, and much harder to measure. And I knew one more conversation still had to happen. Autumn arrived slowly that year. By October of 2024, the skyline outside Evan's windows no longer felt like a stage. It felt like background, quiet, functional, real. He had taken the advisory job, smaller firm, modest office, no glass towers, no catered lunches, just a desk, 2 monitors, and clients who asked practical questions instead of admiring the view. His first paycheck wasn't dramatic. It didn't change his life overnight. But it was earned without leverage. That mattered. One evening, he invited me back to Minneapolis. Not for a celebration, for dinner. He cooked. Nothing curated, nothing photographed. Just grilled chicken, rice, and steamed vegetables. The apartment looked different now. Fewer objects, fewer statements, cleaner lines, clearer mind. We sat at the same island where the spreadsheets once lay scattered. "I renegotiated the HOA fees," he said casually. "Found an inefficiency in the billing structure." I nodded. That was the Evan I raised, not the one chasing status, but the one fixing problems. "And the lease?" I asked. "On time," he replied. "Every month." 36 clean months. That was the condition. No resets, no illusions. He paused, then reached into a drawer and pulled out something I hadn't expected. My boots, the same pair I had worn the night of the housewarming in 2019. I had left them in his hallway months ago without realizing. "I kept these," he said quietly. I looked at them, worn leather, cracked at the seams, still steady. "I used to think they made you look small," he continued. "Now I see they just made you look grounded." There it was. Not apology. Understanding. Understanding lasts longer. A week later, Grant Holloway finalized the last administrative notice of the divorce settlement. The file closed cleanly. No hidden disputes. No contested property. Natalie had moved to another state. Consulting work. Smaller apartment. No skyline. I heard through a mutual contact that she was doing fine. Quieter life. Less performance. I didn't wish her harm. I wished her clarity. Back in Duluth, I reviewed the lease ledger one more time. 5 consecutive on-time payments since restructuring. Slow progress. Real progress. Marcus Doyle called that afternoon. "You planning to transfer ownership once compliance is met?" he asked. "Not yet," I replied. He was silent for a moment. "You still don't trust him?" "I trust him to grow," I said. "Ownership comes later. Trust is not a switch, it's a bridge, and bridges take time to build properly." 2 months passed, then 3. No late payments, no new debt flags, no sudden lifestyle upgrades. One Sunday, Evan drove up to Duluth without telling me. He knocked on my door carrying nothing but a grocery bag and a tired smile. "I wanted to see where this all started," he said. We sat at my kitchen table, same wood surface I had reviewed contracts on for decades, same chair where I once stared at my father's silence. "Dad," he said, looking around the room, "I thought you never built anything impressive." I waited. I was wrong. The admission didn't come with drama. It came with maturity. "You built something I couldn't see," he added. "Stability." That word landed differently this time. Not flashy, not loud, just solid. I reached into the closet and handed him a folder. "What's this?" he asked. "Your copy of the full corporate structure," I replied. "Not because you own it, because you need to understand it." He opened it carefully. Page after page of filings, timelines, conditions. "You're teaching me," he said. "I'm preparing you," I answered. He looked up. "For what?" "For the day you earn it." The penthouse still wasn't his. Not legally, not yet. But something else had shifted. The illusion was gone. The pride had softened. And for the first time in 3 years, my son was not trying to be larger than his foundation. He was rebuilding it. Still, there was one final thing I needed to tell him, and it wasn't about property at all. The last thing I needed to tell Evan had nothing to do with contracts, or leases, or corporate structures. It had to do with inheritance, not the legal kind, the quiet kind. We were sitting on the back steps of my house in Duluth when I said it. The air was cold enough to remind you that winter always returns, no matter how mild the autumn feels. "You know what my father left me?" I asked. Evan shook his head. "A sentence," I said. "He told me electricians don't build legacies." I looked down at my hands. They were rougher now, slower, but steady. "I spent years trying to prove him wrong," I continued. "Not by arguing, by working." Evan stared out toward the trees. "And did you?" I stopped needing to. That's the difference. When you build something real, you don't need applause. You don't need skyline views or curated lighting. You don't need strangers to confirm your worth. You just need consistency. The penthouse is still under the LLC. That hasn't changed. 36 clean months are still required before anything moves on paper. I haven't promised him ownership. I've promised him opportunity. Natalie is gone. I don't speak ill of her. Fear can make good people chase the wrong symbols. I hope she finds what she was actually looking for. Not status, but safety. Evan calls every Sunday now. Not to update me on payments, not to discuss equity, just to talk. About work, about cooking, about the quiet things that don't impress anyone but matter anyway. The boots sit by my door, same pair, same scuffs. He once thought they made me look small. Now he understands they simply showed where I stood. Here's what I've learned, and maybe it's worth something to you too. Ownership without discipline is illusion. Money without humility is fragile, and pride, unchecked, is more expensive than debt. If you are listening to this and you have ever felt dismissed because you didn't look impressive enough, I want you to remember something. Stability rarely looks glamorous. It looks ordinary. It looks like showing up. It looks like paying on time. It looks like boots instead of dress shoes. And that kind of stability outlives applause. Evan asked me recently if I ever felt tempted to terminate the lease when I had the chance. I told him the truth. Yes, because power tests a man as much as poverty does. But revenge would have ended the story. Responsibility rebuilt it. And rebuilding is slower. If you stayed with me all the way to the end of this story, I want to thank you. Truly. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I always find it meaningful to see how far these stories travel. And if you've made it this far, rate this story from 1 to 10. Your feedback helps me shape the next one into something even stronger. Please note, this story contains fictionalized elements created for reflection, education, and entertainment. If it moved you even slightly, consider subscribing to Final Act Revenge. There's another story waiting for you on your screen. YouTube seems to think you'll enjoy it.